One human against the Armada, because he refused to let her die. A lone human cargo hauler saves a mysterious alien child from assassins, and that single act of courage puts him at war with the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Jaren Cade never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a hauler, a man who spent his life slipping between the forgotten edges of star systems, trading cargo for credits, and keeping his head low when the patrols of the Armada came sweeping through. His ship was old, patched together from parts that had seen better centuries, and the only crew he trusted was the ship's battered NAV computer, which complained more than it calculated. He wasn't anyone important. He liked it that way. Being important in this galaxy usually meant being dead. On a gray morning on a dusty port moon, he was unloading crates of dried rations. The bazaars smelled of hot spice and recycled air, and traders shouted over one another as they sold their wares. Jaren didn't care about any of it. He only cared about finishing his run, getting paid, and maybe finding a drink strong enough to blur the ache in his bones. He had no intention of noticing the little girl. No intention at all. But some things don't care about intentions. She was small, barely past the age of walking, her skin the faint blue of twilight, her hair silver like threads of frost. She was chasing a tiny wooden toy, a carved animal that bounced and skittered across the stone street. Jaren saw her dart under a skimmer, laughing to herself as she reached for the toy. That was when he noticed the glow beneath the vehicle. A glow that didn't belong. Plasma charge. Improvised explosive. He didn't think. He just moved. His body threw itself forward before his mind caught up. He grabbed the girl by the arms and yanked her backward with all his strength. The charge detonated a second later, fire and shrapnel ripping through the street. Pain seared through his back as metal fragments tore into him, and the blast wave hurled both him and the child across the ground. The world became smoke, fire, and ringing silence. When his vision cleared, he expected to see the girl gone. Instead, she was pressed against his chest, crying but alive. Her wide violet eyes stared up at him, filled with shock and confusion. Jaren staggered to his feet, holding her close. That was when he noticed the assassins. 3 figures emerged from the smoke, cloaked in dark armor, blades and rifles gleaming with heat. They weren't street thugs. They weren't after money. They were here for her. One of them pointed at Jaren, their voice hissing through a mask, "The human has her." Jaren's instincts flared again. He ducked behind the wreckage, pulled his pistol, and fired wildly. 2 shots missed, but the third struck home, dropping one of the assassins. The others hesitated. Then, to his surprise, they withdrew. They melted into the smoke, vanishing without finishing the job. Jaren looked down at the girl, breathing hard. Why had they fled? They could have killed him easily. Why retreat after seeing his face? He didn't have time to question it. Sirens were already rising in the distance. The Armada's enforcers would be here soon, and Jaren knew exactly what would happen. They'd sweep the scene, collect the girl, and erase any witnesses. He had seen it before. Anyone who ended up on their list never came back. He should have walked away. He should have left her. But when she clutched his arm and whispered, voice trembling, "Please don't let them take me," something inside him broke. He took her to his ship. He didn't even remember making the choice. He just knew that by the time the sirens screamed into the port, his freighter was already lifting off, and the little girl was hiding under a blanket in his cabin. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the cold weight of a new reality pressing down on him. Whatever she was, whoever she was, the Armada wanted her dead. And now they would come for him, too. Jaren Cade, cargo hauler, loner, nobody, had just committed the one act the Armada never forgave, defiance. The freighter's engines groaned as they tore free from the gravity well, and Jaren pushed the throttle harder than he ever had before. The little girl sat strapped into the co-pilot's chair, staring wide-eyed at the stars as if they were both a comfort and a warning. She hadn't spoken since whispering those desperate words back in the port, and Jaren didn't know what to say either. He wasn't used to passengers. Especially not children. Especially not hunted ones. He cleared orbit and cut into drift space, but even there he couldn't relax. He kept glancing at the sensors, half expecting to see Armada cruisers burning toward them. Nothing came, not yet. Only the silence of the void. Jaren finally turned to the girl. "What's your name?" he asked, voice rough. She hesitated before whispering, "Elira." The name rang strange, heavy with meaning. Jaren didn't know it then, but whole sectors would come to chant it in the years to follow. For now, it was just a name carried by a scared child with violet eyes. He gave a short nod. "All right, Elira. You'll stay until I find someone safe to leave you with." He wanted to sound firm, but the girl only looked at him with quiet, unreadable eyes, as if she already knew he was lying to himself. The days that followed were a blur of evasion. Jaren jumped from one backwater system to another, never staying long. He swapped transponder codes, repainted hull plates, and even dumped his legitimate cargo into an asteroid field to lighten the ship. But no matter what tricks he pulled, whispers followed. Dock workers asked too many questions. Smugglers who'd once shared drinks with him now eyed him with greedy hunger. Word was spreading, the Armada was offering a fortune for one human pilot and a small alien child. It should have been simple. All he had to do was hand her over. That kind of money could buy him a new ship, a new life. But every time he looked at her, every time he saw the way she curled up in a narrow bunk clutching that carved wooden toy, he knew he couldn't. Something inside him refused. He had saved her once. He wasn't about to throw her to the wolves now. Then came the first real test. They had stopped for fuel at a derelict outpost, one of those half-abandoned husks where traders met to barter off-record. Jaren was halfway through refueling when the sensors screamed, 3 gunships dropping out of drift. Bounty hunters. They swarmed the station, weapons hot, and Jaren barely had time to shove Elira into the smuggling compartment before the first volley struck. The freighter rattled, shields bleeding sparks. Jaren cursed, slammed the throttle, and pulled the freighter into a desperate spin. He had no heavy weapons, no backup, nothing but a single pulse cannon and his stubborn refusal to die. The hunters pressed hard, herding him toward the asteroid belt. He should have panicked. Instead, something strange happened. Elira's voice whispered through the comm system, quiet but steady, "Left, now up. They won't expect the debris cloud." He didn't question how she knew. He just obeyed. And to his shock, her instincts were perfect. Every sudden maneuver threw the hunters off balance, every dive into the tumbling rocks bought them precious seconds. Finally, Jaren swung the freighter behind a massive shard of iron, cut power, and let the hunters sweep past. When they realized it was too late and doubled back, his pulse cannon was waiting. 2 blasts crippled the lead ship, and the others scattered. When it was over, Jaren sat in the cockpit, drenched in sweat. He looked at Elira. She was pale, but calm. Almost too calm. "You knew what they'd do," he said. She lowered her eyes. "I see things sometimes. Paths, choices. If I don't speak, bad things happen." Jaren didn't know what to say to that. But he knew one thing, whatever power she carried, it was why the Armada wanted her silenced. And it was also the only reason they were still alive. Word of their survival spread faster than the Armada could suppress it. Colonists whispered of the human pilot who defied hunters and protected the blue-skinned child. Smugglers who'd once mocked him now raised drinks in his honor. And in the shadows of occupied worlds, rebels listened. For years they had waited for a symbol, for proof the Armada could be defied. And now, without meaning to, Jaren and Elira had become exactly that. The next time hunters came, he wasn't alone. A ragtag flotilla of smugglers and miners intercepted them, lending their firepower to Jaren's escape. When he demanded to know why, they only answered, "If you'll stand against them, so will we." The rebellion spark had been lit. But sparks draw fire. The Armada could not ignore him any longer. Soon, entire cruisers were sweeping the stars, hunting not just for the child but for the human who dared to protect her. Jaren had wanted nothing to do with wars or causes. But war had found him. And there was no going back. Jaren Cade had never been hunted before. He had skirted patrols, slipped past tariffs, lied to inspectors, and once or twice run illegal cargo under someone else's transponder, but this was different. Now every screen in every outpost flashed his face, and the bounty beside it was enough to make old friends look at him like prey. He and Elira lived in constant motion. Every drift jump stretched the freighter's ancient coils to their limits. Every port he dared enter was a gamble. He painted over hull markings again and again, even changed his own appearance, growing out his beard, bleaching streaks of his hair with chemical wash, once even faking an eye injury to fool security scans. But none of it mattered. People still recognized him. And the whispers kept growing, the human who defied the Armada, the girl with the violet eyes. One night in the drift, when the freighter hummed quietly and the stars beyond the viewport streaked like rivers of fire, Elira asked the question Jaren had been dreading. "Why did you save me?" He looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to the console. "Because you were there. Because nobody else moved." "That's not an answer." Jaren exhaled slowly. He wasn't good with words, especially not for children. "I've seen what happens when people look the other way. Too many times. I guess I couldn't do it again." She studied him with unnerving seriousness for someone so young. "That's why they fear you. Not because you're strong. Because you choose." Jaren didn't respond. But her words sat heavy in his chest, like stones that would never lift. Their first brush with real betrayal came on Vera Station, a slumrain clinging to a gas giant's upper orbit. Jaren had trusted an old contact there, a mechanic who owed him more favors than he could count. But the moment Jaren docked, he noticed too many eyes watching, too many shadows shifting in the hangar. The mechanic greeted him with a strained smile and a handshake that lingered too long. Halfway through refueling, armed thugs poured out from the storage bays. Jaren barely had time to shove Elira into a maintenance crawlspace before they opened fire. He ducked behind crates, blasting back with his pistol. The firefight raged across the hangar, plasma bolts sparking against metal. Jaren knew he couldn't win, there were too many of them. Then Elira's voice echoed faintly through the ship's comm, trembling but clear. The pipe above them. "Shoot it." Jaren trusted her without thinking. One well-placed shot ruptured the coolant main, and scalding vapor erupted into the bay. The thugs scattered, coughing and blinded. Jaren hauled Elira back into the freighter, engines roaring. As they tore free of the station, he glimpsed the mechanic's face twisted in fear and regret. The bounty had been too tempting. Trust was dead in this galaxy. The next weeks blurred into survival. On a frozen moon, Jaren scavenged fuel cells from a wreck while Elira huddled inside the freighter, her breath fogging in the bitter cold. On a desert world, they bartered with nomads for water, only for Armada drones to descend like hawks, forcing them into a desperate chase across sandstorms. One night, while hiding in the shadow of a broken asteroid ring, Elira asked about Earth. Jaren had not spoken of it in years. He told her about oceans that stretched forever, skies filled with birds instead of ships, cities that glowed with lights like constellations turned upside down. She listened with wide eyes, then whispered, "I want to see it." Jaren said nothing. Earth was gone, a cradle long abandoned. But he didn't have the heart to tell her. Instead, he said, "Maybe someday." It was on the mining colony of Dravenholt that the first embers of rebellion truly caught fire. The colony was nothing more than tunnels carved into rock, filled with miners who lived and died under Armada taxes. Jaren only wanted to trade for supplies, but the moment he stepped off his freighter, whispers swept the crowd. Faces turned. A man spat on the ground and muttered, "That's him." Another shouted, "The human who defied them." By the time Jaren realized what was happening, dozens of miners had surrounded him. Not to kill, not to betray, but to beg. "Tell us it's true. Tell us you fought them and lived. Tell us one man can make them bleed." Jaren wanted to deny it, to push them away. But then Elira stepped forward, her small hand in his. She looked up at the miners and simply said, "He saved me. He will save others, too." The crowd erupted. Not in fear, but in hope. And that was the most dangerous weapon of all. Soon, smugglers offered him safe passage. Miners offered to sabotage Armada patrols. Exiles whispered codes into his comms. Everywhere he went, people rose just a little straighter, dared speak just a little louder. The Armada noticed. And their response was merciless. The climax of the middle came at the belt of Carix, where 3 Armada destroyers cornered Jaren in open space. For the first time, he faced overwhelming firepower with no cover. Plasma storms lit the void, cannon fire seared across his shields, and the freighter screamed with every hit. Jaren's hands flew over controls, sweat stinging his eyes. "This is it, girl," he muttered. "No tricks left." But Elira closed her eyes, her voice calm. "Not yet. They can be divided. You must trust me." Against every instinct, Jaren obeyed. He feigned engine failure, letting the freighter drift helplessly. The destroyers closed in, hungry for the kill. At the last second, he ignited every thruster, slingshotting between them just as a plasma storm flared. The lead destroyer panicked, its volley striking its own ally. In the chaos, Jaren ripped through the storm, shields failing, hull cracking. But when he emerged, 2 destroyers were crippled, and the third was retreating. The galaxy took notice. The Armada could be beaten, not by fleets, but by one stubborn human and a child they could not kill. And in the shadows, rebellion spread like fire. The Armada had been patient at first. They had sent hunters, mercenaries, and assassins. All had failed. Now patience is gone. Entire fleets scoured the stars, checkpoints locked down drift lanes, and bounties painted Jaren's face across every terminal. He had become something he never wanted to be, the most wanted human in the galaxy. For weeks he and Elira lived in motion, never staying in one port long enough to breathe. The child grew quieter as the net closed in, though sometimes her strange gift surfaced, warning him of ambushes, guiding him through impossible jumps. She trusted him completely now. That trust weighed heavier than the stars on his shoulders. Then the trap was sprung. A false distress beacon drew them to an abandoned orbital station, a place of twisted metal and hollow silence. The moment Jaren docked, Armada cruisers emerged from drift. Not a handful. An entire squadron. They had him caged. Sirens blared through the freighter as Jaren slammed controls. No escape routes. No allies close enough to help. Just him, a child, and an empire bearing down. He turned to Elira. Her violet eyes were calm, too calm for a child her age. "They'll kill you if they take you," he said. She nodded. "And they'll kill you if you fight." Jaren laughed, bitter. "Story of my life." He armed the freighter's guns, fully aware they were laughably small against cruisers. But something inside him refused to bow. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was simply that one human could not watch innocence be crushed without spitting in the face of fate. The Armada commander hailed him, voice cold and metallic. "Surrender the girl. You may yet live." Jaren stared at the comm screen, then killed the channel without answering. His reply came in the form of cannon fire. His freighter lunged forward, weaving between the station's shattered girders. The cruisers unleashed a storm of plasma, tearing chunks from the wreckage. Jaren flew like a man possessed, scraping hull against debris, turning every ruined corridor into cover. The first blast he scored was luck. A reactor leak inside the station detonated when his shot pierced a conduit, the explosion crippling one cruiser. The second was skill, luring a pursuer into colliding with the station's skeleton. But there were too many. Shields flickered, alarms screamed, and the freighter groaned as if ready to die. In the middle of chaos, Elira placed her small hand on his arm. "They are watching," she whispered. At first, he thought she meant the Armada. Then he realized she meant something else. Out there, hidden ships were listening. Smugglers, rebels, exiles. People who had heard the tales of the human who defied the Armada. People were waiting to see if he would stand or fall. So Jaren made his choice. He opened every comm channel, every frequency, broadcasting his voice across the system. "This is Jaren Cade. I'm one man, one ship, and they want me gone because I wouldn't let a child die. If that is a crime, then I'll burn for it. But know this, if one man can bleed them, so can all of you. You don't have to bow. Not anymore." The Armada roared back with fire, but it was too late. His words carried further than any cannon. First one, then another, then dozens of ships decloaked around the station. Freighters, mining craft, patched-up fighters, all ragged, all desperate, but all united. They had come because one human's refusal lit a flame they thought long dead. The battle that followed was chaos, but it was no longer Jaren alone. The rebels struck in swarms, overwhelming the Armada squadron through sheer ferocity. When the smoke cleared, the station drifted silently, and half the Armada fleet burned. Jaren's freighter floated among the wrecks, hull battered but alive. The rebels hailed him, calling his name like a rallying cry. But Jaren only sat in his chair, exhausted, staring at the child beside him. "You did this," he muttered. Elira shook her head. "No. You did. You chose." He almost laughed at that. Chosen? He had never wanted any of this. He had only saved a girl because he couldn't stand by. Yet somehow that one choice had become the start of a war. The rebels begged him to lead them, to become their captain, their general. Jaren refused. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a pilot. But as the weeks turned into months, his name spread like fire. The Armada cursed it. The oppressed whispered it. And across the galaxy, men and women rose because they had seen one human stand against an Armada and live. In quiet moments, Jaren sat in the freighter's cockpit, stars sliding past like endless rivers. Elira would sit beside him, clutching her wooden toy, her eyes filled with strange futures. He knew the war ahead would be long. He knew the Armada would never stop hunting them. But he also knew one truth, the only truth that mattered. He was no longer running. And the galaxy would never be the same again. The Armada had reached its breaking point. They could not allow the myth of Jaren Cade to spread any further. To them, he was not a man, but a virus infecting the oppressed with hope. And hope was more dangerous than any weapon. So they set the trap. The false distress call lured him to the dead station over Arvis Prime. From the moment Jaren's freighter docked, he knew. Too quiet. Too easy. Then the stars outside flared, and a fleet of Armada cruisers bled into real space, blotting out the light. Not a handful. Not a squadron. A fleet. Jaren cursed, slamming controls. Too late. Tractor beams locked on, dragging the freighter into the station's orbit. His shields groaned, powerless against the pull. He turned to Elira. She sat still, her small hands clenched tight around her wooden toy. "They want you," Jaren said. "Not me. I can still give them me and buy you time." She shook her head. "If you give me everything, everything dies. If you fight, maybe something lives. Maybe something dies, too," Jaren muttered. But deep down, he knew she was right. The Armada commander hailed him. A towering figure filled the comm screen, armor black as void, eyes burning with cold fire. Human. The galaxy does not belong to you. It never has. Surrender the girl, and your death will be swift. Refuse, and we will grind your rebellion into dust. Jaren cut the channel. I've had enough speeches for one lifetime. Then he opened every frequency, broadcasting across the system. His voice was raw and unpolished, but clear. My name is Jaren Cade. I was nobody. A hauler. A man who only wanted to live quietly. Then I saw them going after a child, and I couldn't look away. That's all it took. One choice. And now they call me a threat. If one man saying no can scare them this much, what would happen if we all said no? What would happen if none of us bowed? The Armada answered with fire. Plasma cannons ripped into the station, tearing metal into shrapnel. Jaren's freighter danced between collapsing girders, every maneuver bought with sparks and pain. He struck back when he could, crippling a gunship here, blasting a turret there, but he was bleeding faster than he was hitting. Elira sat beside him, eyes closed, whispering directions. Left. Now dive. 3 seconds, fire. Every call saved them by a hair's breadth. Jaren no longer questioned it. He just trusted. Still, they could not last. His shields failed, engines sputtered, alarms howled. A final salvo tore through the hull, flames licking through the cockpit. Jaren gritted his teeth, ready to make his last stand. And then, ships emerged from the void. Dozens. Scores. Freighters, mining craft, patched-up fighters. Smugglers and exiles. Rebels and colonists. Every soul who had heard his voice and chosen to fight. They swarmed the Armada fleet in a storm of desperate courage. The battle raged for hours. The rebels fought like wolves, tearing at the edges, sacrificing ships to cripple cruisers, swarming with reckless bravery. Jaren's freighter became the rallying point, his voice echoing across comms, "Hold the line. Don't give them an inch." When the dust settled, the Armada fleet was shattered. Half their cruisers burned, the rest limped into retreat. The dead station drifted in silence, lit only by wreckage fires. Jaren sat slumped in the pilot's chair, exhausted beyond words. Elira leaned against him, eyes half closed but shining. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Jaren said hoarsely. "We did." Word spread faster than the Armada could contain it. Across colonies and outposts, people painted his name on walls, whispered it in cantinas, sang it in secret halls. Jaren Cade had become more than a man. He was a symbol. Proof that defiance was possible. The rebels begged him to lead, to take command, to be their general. He refused again and again. He wasn't a leader. He was just a man who made one choice. But deep down, he knew he couldn't run from it forever. The war was coming, whether he wanted it or not. In quiet moments, as the freighter limped across the stars, Jaren would sit at the viewport with Elira beside him. She would clutch her toy and tell him of visions, futures of fire, futures of light, futures that terrified her. And Jaren would listen, knowing that together they had already changed the course of history. The Armada had thrown everything at him and failed. And though he was only one human, one stubborn fool who refused to let a child die, the galaxy would never be the same.